Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi. Since the Trump administration, there's been a paradigm shift in the U.S.-led post-Second War free trade, industrial policy, trade tariffs, and to a certain extent, protectionism have now dominated the global economic conversations. Today's guest is Matt Goodman, who leads the Geoeconomic Studies program at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a former director of international economics at the White House National Security Council during the Obama and Bush administrations. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
All right. What a few weeks. We'll start with the RNC. So the Republican National Convention just ended with Trump painting an American future rooted in self-interested economic and foreign policy. How has the Make America Great movement, the MAGA movement, changed America's international economic engagement?
Well, it's certainly been an exciting few weeks here in the U.S. politically, and that is one of the significant events that you're talking about, the Republican convention, possibly the least interesting development over the last few weeks, in the sense that we've also had a pretty remarkable change in on the Democratic side of the aisle, and we've had this assassination attempt against Trump. So there's been a lot of drama here in politics.
I jokingly said that it's made all the journalists around the world very busy, actually.
Exactly. It's busy time for all of you. But good question. And I think that, I would answer that question first by saying that I think in both parties and really across the political spectrum in the United States, there's been a pretty significant change in our views and approach to trade policy, to U.S. engagement in the international economy. And this is something that actually goes back probably decades. We used to have a consensus in the United States about our engagement in the world economy, certainly coming out of World War II. We had that implicit consensus, and that's why we were able to do things like the Marshall Plan, like building the World Bank, the IMF, the other
Bretton Woods, yeah.
Right, the Bretton Woods institutions. But that consensus started to break down as early as the 1970s, when there were changes in our economy that were pretty profound, and changes in the view of Washington because of Watergate and Vietnam. And so trust kind of broke down. And then there were a bunch of other shocks along the way that have really changed people's view, I think, of the U.S. role in the international economy. And that's really what we are studying here at the Council on Foreign Relations in our new initiative that we can talk more about if you're interested. But yeah, I think the Republican platform really reflects on some level some of those changes in the overall consensus here, with a particular Trumpian twist to those issues.
Yeah, it's interesting that you actually dated back to the 70s, but I don't think there's that much rhetorical kind of advocacy, in terms of saying America first and truly trying to make America look like it's less interested in international engagement, and therefore sort of isolationism has come up more than a few times. And of course, China in some way has become sort of the center of whether, it's MAGA economics or, MAGA foreign policy, right? What's fascinating is that it has united both domestically in terms of the, left behinds, I would call them, due to decades of globalization. It has also united the national security hawks, whether it's from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, especially given the new frontier of technology competition. So what I would like you to talk about, since you used to lead a lot of the trade and economic initiatives, and you believe that policymaking is all about trade-offs, right? So what are the trade-offs when there's such change in terms of U.S. policy toward China?
Well, I think you've captured it right, that both parties again are I think looking more inward in terms of their put it charitably, their concern about those who have been disrupted, displaced by a combination of globalization and technological change. I think both the Biden and Trump administrations have been playing to that audience, and both parties, both administrations, have been, more hardline on China. The one big difference, though, is that I think the Biden administration has been more engaged in the world and, has worked to strengthen alliances. And I wouldn't call it an isolationist administration. So that is a big difference, and one that I think will continue under whoever gets elected. I mean, that difference will continue depending on who gets elected in November. We can come back to that. I mean, on China, look, I think that there are some genuine concerns here that go beyond national security. The national security concerns are real and vivid here in Washington, and that's what we do in Washington. So, I think it's appropriate that the U.S. government should be concerned about some of the actions by China in its own near abroad. The concerns about building up sort of non-transparently this military capability for purposes that are still unknown. There are concerns about technology and the way China is acquiring technological leads. I think that is all legitimate set of national security related concerns. In addition, I think there's a range of economic concerns regarding China. It's overcapacity, it's massive subsidization and sort of structural imbalances in the Chinese economy, where consumption is underplayed and investment and production are invested in heavily with government subsidies. This is a concern that the Treasury Undersecretary Jay Shambaugh spoke at the Council on Foreign Relations about a couple of weeks ago. So those are among the many concerns on the economic front that I think have also created, frankly, bipartisan concern about the People's Republic of China's policies and practices that I think, again, is going to continue into a new administration.
Yeah, I think, sort of the tension on economic issues, this is not new, right? I remember even in the Obama administration, there was a lot of, I would say, dispute around, for example, the renminbi, whether it should devaluate or not, in terms of development assistance and debt trapped, we can talk about it later. But there are a lot more, it seems, other issues these days. And so the fact that Washington, D.C. Decided to take a different approach to China, what are the trade-offs? I guess that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yes, and you did ask about trade-offs, and thank you for that little shout out for this platform we have here at CFR called Trade-Offs, with a little seesaw that shows that there are always trade-offs in life. And in these international economic policy decisions, there are trade-offs. So, for example, if we want to restrict trade with China through tariffs, and most of the things we buy as consumers in some way either come from China or have a China nexus, then there is probably going to be an inflationary price to pay. So there's a trade-off there. If we're trying to fight inflation at the same time that we want to de-risk or raise tariffs on China, there's a trade-off. The point about trade-offs, though, to be fair, is that it's not that one is definitely better than the other side of the seesaw. There are arguments for fighting inflation, and there are arguments for de-risking from China. And it's a question of how you balance those trade-offs. And, I think that is something that we are looking at here at CFR, but I'd say more broadly is being debated pretty actively in Washington.
Yeah, I think one really good example, and that, is very relevant to Taiwan, is semiconductors. For decades, America has decided to outsource semiconductor manufacturing to other countries, including Taiwan. And now, obviously, there's a different concern because of national security and supply chain resilience, etc. But in a recent interview with Bloomberg, Trump said that Taiwan took away all of America's semiconductor businesses. So how do you interpret what he meant and what that might mean for if there's a second Trump administration semiconductor policy, how is that going to be different from the Biden administration's?
Well, I think with Donald Trump, you always have to be careful to put some kind of filter on the things that he says. It's not clear exactly what he really would do about things he talks about. The one area in which he seems to have a serious policy view is on trade. And he thinks that we have been taken advantage of by our trading partners. He's thought that for many decades, since really it was Japan in the 1980s that started his interest in these issues. And he thought Japan was taking advantage of us. It's his concern is no longer as focused on Japan as it is on China and other trading partners. So I think that's at the heart of the point. I wouldn't take the literal point too seriously about what he's going to do on semiconductors made in Taiwan. I think it's more a reflection of his general sense that we're being taken advantage of in some way.
I do think there is certain anxiety, and since TSMC, the leading semiconductor manufacturer, has to invest in Arizona and other related investments being sort of onshored in the United States, there is a lot of anxiety in Taiwan in terms of whether this industry will be hollowed out for the United States, right? And of course, on the campaign trail, even in the primary during the Republicans' primary campaign, there's also the argument for sort of just making sure the U.S. has the Taiwan semiconductor industry, and then the rest, you don't have to take care of that. And so I think you can say you don't have to pay so much attention to what he might mean, but it also might mean something in terms of a new administration's policy. But I also wanted to get your thoughts on this administration's policy. Well, we all know that the CHIPS and Science Act has been very popular, I would say, among industry leaders from everyone I talked to. However, the export control policy seems to elicit more questions and more doubts, especially regarding if it could truly impede China's chip development capabilities and whether this policy is truly good for American companies. So what is the trade-off here?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just say on semiconductors that there is just a reality that we get a substantial number of our chips from one great source, TSMC, which is a great company, and from Taiwan. And I think it's partly a national security concern, but it's partly the vulnerabilities that were exposed during the pandemic and the supply chain shocks. There's a concern that we shouldn't be so reliant on any one place for such an important item. And so I think in both parties and across the political spectrum, again, I think there is a belief that we ought to be trying to diversify supply chains for things like semiconductors. That doesn't mean hollowing out of Taiwan is a policy objective and of either party, really. And it doesn't mean that Taiwan always is it's a zero-sum loss for Taiwan, because as you said, if Taiwan's still going to probably and TSMC are still going to provide a predominant supply of the chips that we need, and they're going to they are investing in the United States and other markets around the world, and I think that is going to help diversify that supply chain, and I think that's what people are really focused on here, and I think probably rightly so, because we don't want to be overly dependent on any one place or one company. But again, that doesn't mean that we're going to stop doing business with that place or with that company. It just means we're going to try and have a diversity of supply from various places, including at home. So but there are costs in this, and to your point about trade-offs, any policy that sort of moves against what the basic market forces are is going to impose some kind of cost. But in life, I buy insurance because I'm worried about, crime, or I'm worried about my car having an accident, so I buy insurance, and that's a cost. One does pay and realize that you have to pay for some things to get peace of mind, or to get, what you need. And so I think the question is how much of a cost for what benefit. So that's really what the trade-off conversation is about.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's another major trade-off that's currently being discussed in Washington, D.C. Although the policy started in the Trump administration, which is a CFIUS, right? The committee that reviews foreign investment in the United States if they have any sort of national security concerns. So we know that's been applied to a lot of, in the case of investment coming from China. And it looks like by the end of this year, we may see another kind of reverse investment restriction, which is outbound investment to China. And so what would the implications be if that policy does come through? And again, what are the trade-offs for restricting investment from both sides to each other's side?
Well, I think there's a bundle of policy tools that you've talked about in the previous question about export controls, which I guess I didn't answer, but I can now bundle it with the inbound investment screening policies and this new effort to take a targeted approach to limiting some outbound investments into certain technologies in certain places. And that is going to happen. The Treasury Department has a notice out of new rules, and the notice period ends in a couple of weeks in early August, and they will put in place some kind of measures to limit certain types of investment into certain types of technology, AI, semiconductors, and quantum computing, and so that's going to happen and be added to this toolkit. And I think the source of the concern here is about certain sensitive technologies that are at a minimum dual use, if not actually military, clearly have military applications that we don't want our adversaries to have, or at least we want to slow down their ability to obtain those things. And that gets to some of the skepticism in your previous question. Is this something that really is going to work? Is it something that is going to cause other costs? And I think that's all true, but I think the government here, the White House, feels pretty strongly that it needs to try to kind of throw sand in the gears and try and make it more difficult for China to acquire these really sensitive technologies. But it is going to be important to follow through on enforcement. It's going to be important to get partners to align with us, because water will find its way around the dam if we don't have alignment of these policies, and it will pose a cost. You're right. There will be a cost, including to semiconductor exporters here who need to sell to China in order to make the profits to reinvest in their innovative new semiconductor production. So there is a cost, but I think the government has decided that this is a cost that we have to pay.
Yeah. Well, then there's another trade-off we have to discuss, which is you kind of alluded to overcapacity, which has also been a hot topic between US, Europe, and China. I guess my question is really sort of, we know China has overproduced a lot of things over the, decades. But in the past, the US kind of, and the rest of the world, just embraced the cheap goods, right? Because it's good for a lot of consumers. But now, because the overcapacity, it actually touches on sectors that are more sensitive. For example, microchips, EVs and other green products. And so it's viewed as a threat to economic competitiveness in the United States. So, but, there's also another argument, if we restrict this kind of import of those products, green products, then it will actually affect the US green transition. And so how do you think about this trade-off?
Yeah, no, I would agree with the premise of your question again, that there is a trade-off here in that we want to promote the clean energy transition, and China does produce good quality products at an affordable price. It is also true that they have been able to do that largely by a combination of stealing technology and by huge subsidies and ramping up production and not doing enough at home to consume those things. And so that has caused some disruption and distortion in the global economy. And as Undersecretary Shambaugh from Treasury said the other day, you have production now in some areas that is not only outstripping realistic Chinese demand projections, but global demand projections. And I think there is a clear view now here in Washington that is very disruptive to the global economy, and that we need to do something about it. Exactly what we do about it, is under debate. We've taken some initial steps on tariffs, but fairly targeted so far, in order to provide space for us to develop our own capabilities and to support the investments that have been made in the Inflation Reduction Act in our own clean energy technology. So I think that's the debate, but no question, like any measure, as I say, where government intervenes in the market, there is likely to be a cost somewhere in the system, whether it's access to good quality, affordable products or just, paying more. For downstream, buyers of these things, there's definitely those trade-offs, and it's a question of, you can come out in a reasonable position on either side as long as you're honestly weighing those costs and benefits and being transparent about why we're doing this, and then people can debate it. But
do you think
here.
in this green industry, let's just say the green sector, the U.S. is veering towards a protectionism kind of approach?
I mean, I think that in its statement on May 14th, when it announced these tariffs, these targeted tariffs on $18 billion worth of Chinese imports, the Biden administration used the word protect a couple of times. It's clear that they are, in that sense, trying to protect a domestic production capability, that is the areas where we've targeted our our IRA policies. And so if you want to call that protectionist, yes, it is. And tariff increases are also, a form of protectionism. But I think the administration would argue that it's been, as I say, pretty targeted, pretty limited. It's only $18 billion, not like, the 10% tariffs that President Trump, if he's reelected, is proposing to impose on all imports, and 60% plus on imports from China. So that would really probably have a serious inflationary effect and limit our ability to access some goods and services that Americans want and need. So, so that's a different ballpark. That's the administration would certainly argue that that's a very different thing from what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, I think from outside looking inside in terms of what some of the latest policies, whether it's Trump administration or Biden administration, it's been quite interesting to see the changes over the years, right? Especially you have served in the Bush administration and the Obama administration. From that era, which embraced globalization, free trade, it does feel like it's a dramatic shift. I also wanted to talk about, since you talk about the Marshall Plan. For decades, right, the U.S. has very much focused on development assistance because there's this belief that, helping other countries develop economically, has good benefits for whether it's democracy or political stability and human rights status improvement. However, right, China has been doing that as well. And of course, China doesn't impose its own values, quote unquote, from their point of view. And so, however, there is a concern that countries may be subjugated to debt traps. So China could maneuver and use their political influence because of this debt traps. So how does the U.S. manage that, especially given that there's less and less support for development assistance and engagement with developing countries, in particular in the U.S. Congress?
Yes, well, this subject has been very much under debate for almost a decade here in Washington since China announced the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in around 2014-15. And there's been a lot of concern about some of the issues you talked about, China, making these investments with sort of low standards and promoting environmental damage and corruption, and then not leaving much developmental benefit behind, and creating debt problems for a lot of the recipient countries. That's been a huge debate here for about a decade. It has quieted down a little bit because China seems to be finding some blowback and pushback and lack of benefit to it from that kind of investment. And so I think it's a bit, China's shifting and doing less Belt and Road investments and more targeted ones at things that aren't quite so dirty and disruptive, is my sense. And so that's sort of quieted the debate here. But there's still a debate about this. And I think the answer that we've come to, from initially thinking that we should stop the Belt and Road Initiative, many people sort of were arguing that, maybe late by Obama and then into the Trump administration. I think now the focus is on what the U.S. can offer as an alternative.
Yes.
And so there are initiatives like the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment and related policies to try to get a combination of government investment and crowded in private investment into these countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, rest of Asia.
But I think that's realistically speaking, right? The U.S. government doesn't have that much money, relatively speaking, and it's really hard to convince the private sector sort of the promising economic opportunities in those places.
Right.
So maybe that's also one of the reasons why this kind of advocacy has quieted down a little bit, because it's harder for the U.S. to do any advocacy around it.
Well, the work is going on. I mean, I think more quietly behind the scenes. I know lots of people in the U.S. government who are working on these issues at the U.S. Agency for International Development, at the State Department, and the White House. And I think the efforts are going on. It is true that we don't have unlimited public support for our international endeavors generally, as I said at the very beginning, and specifically for doing things that seem to be, foreign assistance. That is true. And it's true that this is a difficult business, infrastructure investment in particular, and particularly overseas, and private sector is going to need to see a balance of return on their risky investment in order to undertake this business. But if a relatively small amount of public money can be brought to the table in a creative way that actually helps mitigate some of those risks and create the private sector incentive to want to go in and make these investments and make a long-term return, then I think it can work. And I think it's something that is still worth watching, because there is some interesting stuff going on in that space. It's not going to be as big as Belt and Road, but even Belt and Road is not as big as Belt and Road was originally envisaged to be. This is a difficult business.
Yeah. Well, we know the big news over the weekend is Kamala Harris is now going to run on the Democratic Party's ticket as the presidential nominee. What do you think a Kamala Harris administration's international economic policy may look like? How will it be different from the Biden administration's?
Well, it's only been about 24 hours. We haven't even formally nominated her yet as the candidate for the Democratic race. So it's a little bit early to really parse her
based on sort of her staff
perspective policy. But having said that, I think that there is a likelihood that she's going to broadly continue the approach of the Biden administration of trying to invest at home, trying to work with allies, trying to promote some of these initiatives that we just were talking about, and probably not to engage in an assertive new trade policy, akin to the kind that were done by previous administrations up through the Obama administration, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I don't think she's going to pursue things like that in the short term. She had a pretty strong view about the renegotiation of the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement, the old NAFTA agreement, and she opposed it as a senator, which was one of the few senators, even Democrats, who opposed it. And it was largely because of concerns about the environmental standards she still thought were not high enough. So I expect environmental concerns as well as labor and others will feature heavily in her trade policy.
So will she take an even more left-leaning approach to trade and labor?
I don't know. On the other hand, she previous to that, she had been, before that USMCA vote, she had said some positive things about trade, and she has recognized that we need export markets, that we need, competitive imports. And so I think it's going to be an interesting chance to potentially course correct on some aspects of policy in this area. We'll see. I don't think it's going to be a dramatic change in the short term. It's frankly not probably the highest priority for a new administration. A Harris administration to work on trade issues. There are a lot of other things that they're probably more focused on. But I think you could see broad continuity, but with some tweaks in approach going forward.
Well, with that, thank you so much, Matt, for joining us today. I want to quote TSMC's founder, Morris Chang, famously said, "Globalization is dead." I think it's a little bit of exaggeration, but
I think so. With all due respect to a great man, I think that may be a little overstated. I think globalization is definitely going to look different going forward, but it still exists.
Yes, it does. And I think even we are seeing some trade blocks being formed, right? But it doesn't mean trade is dead. Maybe just that the trade, we knew it from previous, pre-Obama administration. But thank you so much for helping us understand what is going on in today's international economics. It's been a lot of changes, and we expect more to come and hope to have you back later. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, Wenchi.